All right, I think we'll jump right into the next panel here. We have assured everybody here we will adjourn precisely at 11, if not before. So let me start by, this panel is going to be a little bit different focus rather than the view from the boardroom, more the view from the policy world. I'm going to start, just go down the line, Mark Bogliano, who is with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. For those of you who don't know, Howard Hughes Medical Institute is one of the largest, certainly the largest private funder of medical research in the world. It plays a powerful role in advancing biomedical research and science education in the United States. Both of those areas it's quite innovative in. Before joining HHMI in December of last year, Mark served as president and CEO of XBRL US, which, for those of you who know, is a XML business reporting standard enterprise to deal with open source language for financial markets and doing that. So he has a long, Mark's interesting background. He has a long background both in IT and in biotechnology and life sciences. He has a background also in genetics and microbiology. And has a long background here in the Washington area, been on the part of the Board of Trade, the Council Foundations, and other groups, so thank you. I will introduce Congressman Polis in a few minutes when he gets here. Joe Waz is the Senior Vice President, External Affairs and Public Policy Counsel for the Comcast Corporation. Joe has a primary responsibility for Comcast public policy positions, advocacy strategies. He's also a frequent speaker on and panelist on all aspects of communications and internet policy issues, and has a long and distinguished background in serving on various boards and other. And I guess it's publicly announced what we heard last night. Is that?
It's officially leaked. Yes.
All right. It has been officially leaked that. Unfortunately, Joe is going to be retiring soon, so we're really going to miss Joe in his official position, but certainly hope we can all continue to work with Joe as we go forward. Let's see, John Ratcliffe. I'll get to Phil here in a second. John is the Director of Policy for Governor Martin O'Malley in Maryland. In this position, he advises the governor, the senior executive staff, and cabinet secretaries on implementation of a wide range of state policies. Prior to joining the O'Malley administration, the governor's office, he was the Director of Environment, Energy, and Natural Resources Division and Homeland Security and Technology Division at the National Governors Association. Has a long background. He was legislative counsel in the U.S. House of Representatives. For the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, also Small Business and Higher Ed and Workforce, and is a policy wonk who is in the policy trenches. So thank you, John, for joining us. And Congressman Jared Polis to my immediate left. Congressman Polis is it was elected in 2008 from representing Colorado's 2nd Congressional District. He currently serves on the House Rules Committee, and the House Democratic Steering and Policy Committee, and the Democratic Caucus Regional Whip. He's also a charter member and vice chair of the Sustainable Energy and Environment Coalition, the chair of the Immigration Task Force at the Progressive Caucus. But in addition to that distinguished career, he's also a successful innovator and entrepreneur. He founded several successful internet companies, including ProFlowers.com and BlueMountain.com. And in 2000, he was named by Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year. And that year, he also ran for Colorado State Board of Education. So again, valuable mix of both policy, legislative, and high-tech entrepreneurial experience. And finally, Phil Weiser. Phil is the senior advisor to the National Economic Council and director for technology and innovation. So Phil really leads all of the NEC work in the White House on technology and innovation. Phil, before that post, was the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for International Policy and Appellate Matters in the Justice Department's Antitrust Division. Prior to that, he had established a National Center of Excellence in Telecommunications and Technology Law at University of Colorado Boulder, where he's written a number of really outstanding books, including Digital Crossroads. And then before that, he was Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Antitrust Division in the U.S. Department of Justice back in the Clinton administration. And I've had the pleasure of knowing Phil for a long time, and Phil was an expert affiliated scholar before he had to give up that esteemed post to join the administration. So Phil, thank you for joining us. So I think what we'll do is, just as we did in the last panel, I'd like to go down the line and have each of the speakers just maybe 5-7 minutes of your thoughts and reactions to the administration's plan, and then we'll let Phil at the end make some comments, and then hopefully have time for discussion and perhaps Q&A. So Congressman Polis.
Sure, thank you. Let me get a sense of who's here. How many of you are from the private sector? Private sector, okay. And how many of you are from the nonprofit sector? Okay, and then government, Hill staff, wherever else. Okay, good. So we got a good combination here, and it looks like a good representation from the private sector. I would worry if there were fewer people from the private sector, so I'm glad to see that we're beginning to reach out to kind of the right kind of audiences, because it is, of course, you that will be creating jobs that will benefit from the government doing the right kinds of things with regard to innovation. I had a good degree of success in the private sector, having founded several internet-related companies, and in fact, we owe that all to the government, because it was, of course, the federal government that effectively started the internet with ARPANET and through the network that connected our universities. Now, again, I think the government knew when to get out as well. And my companies in particular had very little to do with the government, and that's what I always, whenever I counsel businesses and entrepreneurs, I say try to start a company that has very little to do with the government, and that way you won't have to deal with the political side of things. But without that government investment, the entire internet sector would not be here today, and so we don't know what the next internet will be, but every day the basic research function, whether that's biomedical research, attacking some of the diseases that might affect yourselves, our families, our loved ones, or whether it's the basic research on renewable energy that plays a critical role in keeping America competitive. A lot of that is either funded by the federal government or conducted by the federal government. It can be either. We have in my district National Renewable Energies Laboratory, where a lot of the cutting-edge renewable energy research is done. There's also funding for research that goes out to many of our fine research universities and institutions across the country. And the two complement one another, both the direct research and the funding of research. Now, in terms of making America competitive, these issues of human capital are critical, and that's what I spend most of my time on in Congress, and I'm just thrilled to see a lot of this reflected in the administration's plans, particularly the importance of education, what we call STEM education, science, technology, engineering, math. We are squandering our human capital in this country to an extent that not only is, of course, immoral and makes many of us worry about the gap that we have in opportunity in our country, but from a competitiveness standpoint, really threatens the position of the United States as a global leader in the idea economy, which is, of course, where the global economy is headed. America may not be the best country to compete on low-end manufacturing, nor should we aspire to that. We need to compete for the new generation of jobs that require intellectual capital as much or more than they require physical capital. And to do that, we need to do a better job within public education, increasing access to higher education, and complementing that, of course, with an immigration system that attracts and allows the best and brightest from across the world to work and deploy their skills here, rather than be forced to do so in other countries. With regard to education, the administration is doing exactly the right things, both within this report as well as in the Department of Education, where Secretary Duncan is really doing a lot of pioneering work and helping to using limited federal leverage that we have, of course, because education is a very locally controlled phenomena, but using that leverage through initiatives like Race to the Top, preparing kids to succeed in the next century. The administration and Congress have already succeeded at increasing Pell Grants. That'll be a battle that we fight to maintain. That's a way that low-income individuals can afford higher education. We hope to work on, with the administration, a Workforce Investment Act or WIA reauthorization, again, trying to align the skills that we're training for with the needs of the private sector and involve the private sector more with regard to how federal education dollars are spent at all levels. So it's not only a matter of access to college, it's also looking at the needs of the workforce in terms of skills for employability and what sectors are growing. I think market-based solutions are understood to be the approach we need to take with regard to incentivizing, whether it's through the research tax credit or whether it's through making sure our intellectual property system works more efficiently. These important developments are not within the public sector. The action is in the private sector. At times the basic research is in the public sector. The enabling tools are in the public sector. The preparation of human capital is in the public sector. But everything that counts at the end of the day is in the private sector. So that's why this relationship and this dialogue is so important. If what the public sector is doing is not leading to your success and is not aligned with growth in the private sector, then we're doing the wrong things, and we need to hear that. So I think that the administration has heard that message, is in a great dialogue that Phil is a part of and others with the private sector. And it's not something that we can afford to get wrong. And one of the dangers of what you've seen, for instance, with the agenda of, for instance, the House Republicans and the continuing resolution that they sought to pass is it really undermines a lot of the critical efforts of the federal government with regard to an innovation agenda. So slashing research dollars for renewable energy for, again, ideological reasons. I mean, setting aside this whole, debate, and, I think the science is clear with regard to global warming, but for whatever ideological reasons, there's people in different, camps on that. But setting that aside, this is a critical economic priority for this country to create a renewable energy future, reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, even, again, setting aside the environmental issues. Of course, healthcare, new cures, and new biomedical technology. So, again, I think it's critical that we stand, with the president in making sure that we don't sell America short and we don't undermine our 5, our 10, our 15-year growth agenda in the name of 1 or 2 year savings. Not only is that bad for our economy, it's actually bad for our budget deficit in our country. Imagine if the internet had been zeroed out, in the early 1970s, and there was no internet from which would have been built an enormous tax base later on. Thank you.
Thank you. If that would be the case, I wouldn't be emailing you on Prodigy right now.
Exactly. What was that French one called? They had a French proprietary
Minitel.
one. Yeah, exactly, right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We would have all had Minitel terminals. Mark.
Thank you. Well, it's...
You want to pull the mic just a little?
Sure. I'm not a policymaker, but I've had really good seats to policymaking over the last few years. And like Anish, I struggled a little bit on how to be useful in 5-7 minutes. So I decided I would just give you some really quick stories. The first story is right after World War II in the late 40s. I'm really proud of the fact that my mom was one of the first 10 computer scientists in the world, one of the few, very first computer programmers. She was a code breaker.
Were you first woman, probably?
No, there were other women on the first team on ENIAC, and they were mathematicians. There were 3. And they became computer programmers.
Oh, you want to get with?
I've already reserved a dance. But she was a mathematician, and she was brought in. She was recruited and brought to Washington to program the first computer, ENIAC. This was before transistors. There were tubes. The cooling plant took up a floor of the OSS building, the NSA building on C Street. The programming was done with wires, guys with coveralls and screwdrivers and lengths of wire, pliers. The storage, the total storage and processing power is less than today's average email. We're talking, 16K or below. It's kind of hard to fathom, how a much of a breakthrough that was. If you can fast forward a little bit, I did most of my work as a CIO of nonprofits, most of that with the Board of Trade and Economic Development and Workforce Development here in the Washington area. And one of the projects that I did outside of making the trains run on time and introducing new technology was the first study on the technology business community in Washington at a time when it was really transforming the economy in the region. If I could go forward from there to a story, September 15th, 2008. As Rob referred to, I was the president of a nonprofit that developed the first digital dictionary that became part of federal law, and it's for the filings to the SEC and the FDIC from financial institutions. SIBOS is the largest conference of financial services in the world. Every bank, every stock market in the world gathers once a year. This year it was in Vienna, Austria. It was about 1 or 2 o'clock Vienna time, and the opening keynote speaker was the CEO of Citibank. It was the moment that the market was opening in New York, and that happened to be the day that AIG, Lehman Brothers, the big meltdown on that day. You could literally feel 8,000 in an auditorium of 8,000 in this convention center in Vienna, the blackberries buzzing, you know, people leaving. A lot of people would say that that crisis was an information crisis, was a data crisis, and that's a hint of what if you get one message from what I'm about to say, it's about data, big data, and data sharing. 6 months later, I found myself testifying before the House Oversight Committee on the use of data standards for transparency in the markets, particularly about mortgage-backed securities. And now every bank, every publicly traded company, every credit rating agency, every mutual fund now submits its financial reports to the SEC or the FDIC in a tagged XML form that's democratized financial data. In what used to be a very privileged conversation, it's now open and transparent. This is, again, about data sharing. But 2 months ago, I made a pretty big decision, and that was as sort of at what looked to most people as peak, you know, getting the regulations through, getting now this standard used in legal and other regulatory domains outside of accounting. I made a decision after a few months of discussion with my board chair to leave an XML standards organization in the financial world and go to the biomedical world, return to my roots. As a researcher, you know, 30 years ago I was doing genetics research, an idealistic young guy wanting to feed the world and working with international agriculture development and soybeans. And the reason I did that is because I really believe that the innovation in bio is going to drive the same kind of economic growth and improvement in our life and the sharing of data that IT did in the last 20 years. And so now I find myself on the payroll with about a dozen Nobel laureates at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. As Rob said, one of the largest philanthropies. I think we're second to Bill and Melinda Gates, and the largest independent funder of fundamental basic research. And one of the tenets that I really like about it is, and I think it's aligned with this plan, it's something that feels to me very entrepreneurial, is that unlike almost every other funder, we fund people. We don't fund projects. It's a really fundamental difference. So people, several hundred investigators compete, and if they win that competition, for 5 years, they don't have to do administration, they don't have to raise money, they're not shackled to a specific project. We fund those people for 5 years, they become employees of our organization. Many of them are hosted at our research campus along the river, Potomac River, south of Leesburg, Genelia Farm. But most of them are on their campuses, where their home campuses are, whether it's Harvard or Berkeley or Utah or University of Washington. And our mission is to put as many people as possible in a position to make breakthrough research in science. And you know, some of these are higher risk, but much higher return. And the program of work that we have starts with K through 12. So a big part of our mission is in education, and we carry it all the way through postdoc. If you look at the March 11th issue of Science magazine, the entire issue is dedicated to data as a limiting factor to scientific research. So I am now what many people term a data scientist. That's part programmer, that's part statistician, it's part storyteller. But again, if you take anything from this 5-7 minutes, it's that this is what the future is going to look like. The enormous amounts of data that are coming out of microscopes and images. We're reverse engineering nervous system signaling processes, biochemical. What used to take me all day in grad school in a wet lab with test tubes and condensers and titration, they do 10,000 times on a little chip a day. The same person can do 10,000 times as much research, can gather 10,000 times as much data. The breakthroughs that are about to happen with biomedical hold enormous potential: energy, health, environmental. But it's that fundamental research and the sharing of that research. So now what we're seeing is not only are we sharing the journal articles, but we're making the data available not just to the scientific community, but to students in our schools. This is open source science. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Mark. Joe.
Thanks, Rob. First, let me say that Dan Reed covered a lot of ground this morning with which I want to associate myself. I think he made some excellent broad policy points about the innovation strategy and some of the focus areas that we need to zero in on. And at Comcast, we're fans of a lot of the wisdom in the strategy, and we're focusing a lot of energy on it. Brian Roberts, our chairman and CEO, was named by the president to the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness, which is operating under the great leadership of Jeffrey Immelt from GE. And we're looking forward to contributing to the goals laid out in the strategy in a variety of ways, not just within our company, but across the American economy in general. I'd like to talk this morning briefly about three aspects of innovation strategy: entrepreneurialism and the Startup America initiative, regulatory reform and the role it's going to play in promoting jobs, competitiveness, and innovation. And then one idea that the strategy I don't think really addresses, but that I would suggest is a great American strength that goes hand in hand with innovation, and that is creativity. But let me start with entrepreneurialism. The Startup America initiative is terrifically exciting, very thoughtfully put together. As we've had conversations with the folks who put the program together, we've said that Comcast's particular focus here is going to be on minority entrepreneurs. I read on the way over this morning in the Wall Street Journal, and in this form factor, it's called paper, the headline, "Hispanic Surge in California. Latino children for the first time make up a majority of California's under 18 population in 2010. White Californians remain the state's largest demographic group at about 40%. The demographers said Hispanics are poised to take the lead. And whites are on the verge of becoming a minority among all newborn children in the U.S. You go back to those California statistics, I assure you that startups in Silicon Valley don't bear any relationship proportionally to what the population trends are in California. Nor does the role of women. Vivek Wadhwa spoke over at George Mason University a few months ago, and I asked him about this, and he commented something like 52% of startups in Silicon Valley have a person of Indian descent as either a partner, the lead founder, or a partner. I asked him how many women. He said less than 10%. I said, how many Hispanics or African Americans? I would paraphrase by saying he basically said a trace amount, like you see on the labels of certain foods, a trace amount. In what's going to be a majority minority nation, this cannot be our story. Now, the government can't mandate that everybody is going to become an entrepreneur, but it can do more to facilitate and to cultivate, and we're looking for ways to help. One thing that our company announced recently is that this year, within the next couple of months, we're going to launch a $20 million fund to assist minority digital entrepreneurs to get rolling. I was thrilled that in the Startup America plan that it flagged Small Business Administration dollars that would be available to match programs like this. I fully intend for us to take advantage of that. The mentoring aspects of the Startup America plan, including the role of organizations like Techstars, which I understand Congressman Polis and Brad Feld and others were involved in creating a terrifically successful mentoring program that started in Boulder. This is something we want to see minority entrepreneurs be able to, and potential entrepreneurs be able to play a role in. On regulatory reform, it's mentioned in the strategy that there should be a focus on breaking down regulatory barriers to new business. But on January 18th, the President announced a cross-cutting effort across all executive agencies to engage in a thoroughgoing regulatory reform. And while that doesn't necessarily apply by the President's authority to independent agencies, the Chairman of the FCC, Julie Szynikowski, among other independent agency heads, committed themselves to the same goal. Because burdens can land on established businesses as well, including businesses that are going to play a central role in driving the innovation we all want, namely broadband. So last week, a group called Broadband for America, in which we're a participant, sent a letter to Cass Sunstein following up on his invitation, one among many. A lot of folks on the Hill are also making similar requests, saying, help us to understand what your needs are in the way of regulatory reform. We laid out a philosophical view that today's communications marketplace is dynamic, innovative, and competitive. The existing regulatory framework does not fit that marketplace, and what we really need to do is to come up with an approach to regulation that is as innovative as the internet itself. We called on the administration and the FCC to take on the job, and we highlighted 3 areas for immediate attention in the broadband space. The first is to eliminate innovation-destroying technology mandates. The days of the government telling you how you will accomplish goals such as meeting the needs of disabled populations through communications or otherwise fashioning your technology should be behind us. It should not be prescriptive. It should be performance-based, and we're urging new approaches to that. The second is to eliminate burdensome reporting requirements, and I'm sure this is an issue throughout government for all businesses, but there's just a lot of, we need a data-driven government, but there's a lot of data being collected that's just not relevant anymore, if it ever was. And a third area we highlighted is, and this is more consequence to my friends in the phone industry, getting rid of regulatory requirements to apply to something called the long distance sector. I mean, when's the last time anybody in this room thought about making a long distance call? But there are regulations that apply to the phone companies about how they deal with long distance and long distance competitors. The sector effectively doesn't exist anymore. So just 3 good examples of how that particular agency can zero in on regulatory reform. In fact, Brian Roberts is going to be serving on the regulatory reform working group for the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness, and I know he'll be focusing on this not just in our sector, but in all sectors of the economy. A couple words on creativity. Rightly, we're talking about a major focus on STEM and on entrepreneurial education as part of the innovation strategy, but we should not lose sight of where America's competitive edge has been for decades. And as really was described well in a book that we were all reading about a decade ago, The World is Flat, Tom Friedman's book. He pointed out that America's creative economy, movies, TV, music, books, art, design, in all those areas, America remains a world leader. He attributed to that it's a function of our unique freedoms as a nation, and also the quality of our effort to educate the whole brain, the logical left and the creative right. We can't lose sight of that. As we refocus on American innovation, we've got to continue to nurture and cultivate creativity as well. And in fact, in the sidebar this morning with John, he mentioned that that's very much a focus of the policy in Maryland. It needs to be the focus everywhere. I see that at risk. I urge that in our passion to keep up with the world around scientific and technological learning, that we not lose sight of the need to maintain our creative edge. So I'll close for now by commending the President, leaders, and his administration like Anish and Phil, who helped to deliver this excellent document. And I look forward this morning to talking more about how to turn this vision into a reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. One of the things about Washington, it's easy to forget that there are states out there, because we don't live in one. We live in the District of Columbia, and the states have had a long experience, including in Maryland, in focusing on innovation-based economic development. And so, John, you want to bring us a view from the states and how states, including Maryland, see this and can build off of it?
Sure. I think speaking from the perspective of a governor who has made innovation and competitiveness a primary focus and organizing theme, if not the most important organizing theme of his administration, I would say that this is the type of framework that we really want to see from the federal government. Not only does it provide a national framework to promote innovation, but it sets national priorities and provides the opportunity to align resources and have the federal agency speak with a single voice, which is very important, I think, when you're in the state trying to promote certain policy ends, that you get a common message that is aligned with resources, whether they be technical or financial or other, from the federal government. So we're really pleased, and I think I can speak on behalf of all governors just when I say that we're pleased to see this sort of organized approach. I think I'm doubly pleased, and the governor's doubly pleased, in that it focuses on three areas that we have found to be very important in our strategy. Kind of the three-legged stool of innovation in Maryland has been the focus on investment in physical infrastructure. We're a very congested area, so we need our roadways, our port, and our transit systems to work in a way that allows commerce to move. But frankly, also, we're in an area of electricity congestion, so we have a desperate need for reliable, secure sources of power. The second leg of the stool being education and training. The governor believes very strongly that our education policy is one of our biggest economic tools. As Joe mentioned, we have a very, very strong focus on STEM education, but also on arts, both to promote creativity, but also because we believe that it promotes the kind of critical thinking that's going to be very important in every area of innovation. We also believe very strongly in Maryland that our skilled workforce is our biggest economic asset. We're not the lowest cost state, we're not in the lowest cost country, but we do have a skilled workforce that can be very appealing. We have organized our pipelines. I know there was a discussion of pipelines on the first panel to really feed into the workforce needs and the growing clusters in our state, and we've been working very hard to push those pipelines further and further back into, from post-secondary into secondary, elementary, and frankly even to pre-kindergarten and some of those areas. We have focused on this three-legged approach, I think, based on some early work we did back when the governor first came to office in 2007. With the help of the National Governors Association and Michael Porter and other experts, we did an analysis of Maryland's competitive strengths. Where were we relative to, frankly, to other states, but other parts of the world? And we came to focus on three important clusters, which I'm happy to see reflected in the national strategy. The three for us are clean energy, life sciences and biotech, and security IT, especially cybersecurity. I think these are areas where Maryland has some assets that can be really brought to bear in promoting innovation. But I guess in seeing a national strategy, I was also happy to see that there are areas that are being promoted by the federal government that we're not necessarily strong, but there are other regions of the country that are, and that's perfectly appropriate. I guess I'd like to point out that governors have been doing this for a long time. Governors have been focused on their regional economies. They've been focusing on their strengths. So if I had an ask of the federal government, I would say, please harness the power of the governors, as you did with the race to the top, where you put the governors in a position to really use their convening authority, their persuasive authority, the relationships they have with the private sector and the public institutions, particularly education institutions in their states, to really help organize and build these clusters in the regions. And I'm using the word region very specifically here. I would say in the time that I've been doing this, there was a time where governors were very focused on their individual states. I'd say with the new reality of global competition, there's been increasing amount of work that's been done across state boundaries and with their municipal leaders. And I guess I should point out a specific example. When Anish was in the Commonwealth of Virginia, he led the efforts for Governor Kane and I for Governor O'Malley in building a Chesapeake region, a strategy around the Chesapeake region with our partners in the District of Columbia and also Delaware, to really have a focused, aligned strategy where we were all working together. And one of the outcomes with that was this Chesapeake Crescent Innovation Alliance, which is an alliance of the 9 top research universities in this region that are working together in a way they've never done before. And I would say within Maryland, there's even a deeper, among our research universities, that's happening on an even deeper level. These institutions that in the past have been very competitive with one another are working together and partnering in ways that they haven't done before. And I think that's out of a recognition that we really, really need to focus. The last point I would make is I work for a governor who is very data focused. Some would say he's data obsessed, but I mean that in the most positive sense of the word. Everything we do in state government starts with data in terms of the performance of our state agencies. We have a state stat process that takes data, brings our state agencies in front of a review panel that includes the governor every 2 weeks to discuss their performance. We have a governor's delivery unit that uses data to look at our progress on our overall strategic goals. So I guess I would say there's nothing that's more important than an investment in good data and information and the sharing of data and information, and we're very pleased to see that in this strategy. The governor believes very strongly that in the same way that we can employ and deploy health IT to bend the cost curve down on the cost of healthcare in this country, that we can bend the achievement curve up with the deployment of education technology. So the fact that that's such an important part of this, I think, is something that we applaud heartily in Maryland and many other states.
Okay, thank you, John. Phil, a lot of different comments there. You can sort of pick
Yeah,
and
let
choose,
me first start, Rob, by thanking you so much. This has been a great forum. You've been a terrific thought leader in this area. We really appreciate it. We know also that Dean Garfield, I think, is here from ITI, has often worked with you. We appreciate Dean's leadership. And on the home front, Jared, it's great to have you here. It's great having you in Congress. People who don't appreciate what a special story Jared is. He really is one of his generation's leading entrepreneurs. And to decide to go into Congress and to bring his expertise benefits all of us as a nation. So it's really awesome. And to have somebody who cares and lives about innovation. Let me start with a few thoughts and then get a discussion going. First is, we are in an era that we're transitioning from hierarchies to networks. So I think you hit it pretty well, John, when you talked about the way in which you can't simply be state-centric, regional, international. The interconnections in all these ways are changing policy, and we're only beginning to fully understand and grapple with that. One of the reasons we wanted to get this out there is because we want to make connections, facilitate cooperation of a public-private partnership kind. The reason the president set up this Council on Jobs and Competitiveness is to have, again, networks to reach out in all sorts of different ways. There's a great quote that Bill Joy had, which is, the smartest people working on the problems core to your business aren't working for you. And so a challenge is, how do we find receptacles to get interesting, provocative, out of the box, whatever, ideas that can help address our problems. So that's one reason we wanted to do this. Governing in an age of networks presents all sorts of challenges and opportunities. One reason this administration has been so bullish on open data and open government is because it believes you can govern better if you're more transparent. So we want to be as transparent as possible. outlining what our thinking is. If we have things wrong, we want to hear it. If we miss things, we want to hear that too. And this is part of an ongoing process. Not only is there the Jobs Council and Competitiveness that Joe's adverted to, there's also something passed in the American Peace Act calling for Commerce to do a study evaluating innovation competitiveness. That's something we welcome and are taking on. That's going to also give us a chance to take ideas from wherever they come, look at some of these issues. I'll mention a few that are particularly ripe for consideration. Also, as part of the Startup America initiative, there's going to be a roadshow going out to entrepreneurial communities to learn lessons from what's working, what's not working, people's ideas, and frustrations. So that's all part of an ongoing discussion. This is indeed part of that, and we welcome what we have to learn. A few points that I want to start with, and I love the way Jared said it. He didn't use the word that Brad Feld has used and Austin Goolsbee has used, although not today, unfortunately, which is seed corn. And what Austin said when he outlined the strategy in the White House Press Corps was, you don't eat your seed corn because you're really hungry. And right now, we are at risk of eating our seed corn. If we don't invest in R&D as a nation today, future generations will be poorer for it. And this is a painful situation we find ourselves in. To be in a deficit environment, which requires tightening our belts, and to be in a investment deficit requirement on things like education, R&D, and infrastructure is one hell of a combination, and we have to work very hard on both of them. What President Obama said, I think some version of the State of the Union, some version out in Michigan when he rolled out the wireless initiative, is when your family is in tight times, maybe you don't go out to dinner as much, maybe you don't take fancy or any vacations, but you still pay for your kids to go to college. So that's the sort of priorities that we as a nation have to keep in mind. And our seed corn, and you heard Ben Bernanke mention this last week, you've heard Rob talk about it again and again, driving R&D, and I love the way Dan Reed said it. You don't know what's going to happen. We don't always know. When Xerox PARC put a lot of money out there, they came up with a graphical user interface. And Xerox literally didn't know, even once they had it, what they had, and they gave it away to Apple. And that's innovation, which comes from basic research. Bell Labs had lots of great innovations. A lot of it they didn't know how valuable it would be. There was a race between AT&T and Motorola to invent for a wireless phone. AT&T did a lot of the technology and wireless innovation. AT&T thought circa early 1980s that maybe by the end of the 20th century they'd be up to 1 million subscribers. McKinsey helped them come up with that conclusion, by the way. And they were off by a factor of 100. So innovation is exciting because you really don't know where things are going to go. What we do know, and I love the way Jared said this, human capital is extremely valuable. And by investing in human capital, which R&D helps to produce and facilitate, that's our seed corn. Now, on education, the president yesterday spoke in Boston with Melinda Gates talking about the need for an ARPA education. So this gets these two ideas together. We have an opportunity now in thinking about education, and this gets a little bit to what Joe said. How do people learn? How do we foster creativity? How do we foster excitement and passion about STEM? And apropos of what Paula had said, particularly women, and I loved your story, Mark, about your mom. That's really a great story. How do we foster that excitement? Biotechnology. There's so many new frontiers, and if we don't get people, K through 12, getting excited, learning at their own pace, we're missing these opportunities. Productivity in education has been a challenge because we basically have the same business model for education today that we had 30 years ago. You look at other sectors and how the IT revolution has facilitated great productivity, it's embarrassing. But some sectors, we've talked about healthcare, we've talked about education, clean energy is another, see smart grid. There are still huge opportunities there, and that's why we've pointed in those directions. On entrepreneurship, one of the things that Joe didn't say, because Dan sort of said it, so I'll say it again. People are all entrepreneurs. Even if you work for established companies, you're an entrepreneur in yourself, because you can no longer have the view you're going to work for one company and that's your whole career. You have to invest in yourself, your own human capital. You have to market yourself. You have to think about your opportunities. If you're in a large company, you have to be an entrepreneur. I guess they call it intrapreneurship, right? What's the way you can contribute within your company? So that's a fairly different cultural environment, state of mind, and how do we encourage that through mentorship, through education, through access to capital, so people are willing to take risks. That's one of our great strengths. And Joe's point's right on. There are people of color where there may not be as many role models, and this is one of the challenges. How do you break through your legacy? And here we have a legacy that we have to work hard on, which is to catalyze entrepreneurship, and the work that Comcast is doing is fantastic. So I could keep going on. I'll try not to filibuster because we want to have a little bit more time for give and take and questions.
Let me do this. Let me, if folks want to ask a question, I want to actually leave, you've all been very patient. If you want to ask a question, just go up to the mic. But if anybody wants to comment first before we do that, feel free.
Well, actually, I'd like to pick up on what you just said, because we're really talking about a convergence of lots of different disciplines. Before we were talking about incubators, but they were very vertical, and it was square feet and a phone. But now we're talking about platforms that are really multipliers of that human capital. And creating platforms and tool benches that bring together engineering and biotech, infotech and biotech. There's a real acceleration there waiting for us to make happen, I think.
Great. So I'm going to ask everybody if you can keep your question or comment to less than 30 seconds. So right here.
Yeah, to John.
Can you
and
identify yourself too?
Phil, Jim Snyder from Solon. The discrepancy between the grand vision and the political realities of what you're trying to do, and to motivate the example, let's take education and this technology vision. So I say I'm in Maryland, my kids go to a high school with awful advanced science education. The STEM vision in the state has had no impact. He wants to take the Johns Hopkins course, great institution in Maryland, outstanding K-12, technology-based science education. The public schools absolutely won't allow him to do it, and that's the only way he can get to this vision. Same at the presidential level. President gives this soaring great speech about K-12 technology education, but his K-12 technologies are at the Department of Education. She just goes out everywhere. There's always saying, oh, we're not going to use technology to threaten teachers, just going to be a compliment. She's operating completely against the president's vision, and that is the reality of what the Department of Education is doing.
Thanks.
So how do you solve
John, why don't we do that?
this discrepancy between your grand visions and the political realities and try and implement it?
Well, I think there's
Or
do
Phil. Go ahead, John.
you want to start or shall
You can
I?
start.
There's a couple different elements to that question. One has to do with how you implement the vision and who are the players there. I think there's certain levers that we can pull at the state level. The governor has set a variety of goals around STEM education. I think the easiest to explain is we need to triple the number of STEM teachers in the next 5 years so that the quality of teaching, and particularly in math, but in science and technology as well, is raised dramatically. That involves a lot of players, including the teachers' unions, the local boards, the parent-teachers associations, and the students themselves. We have taken a strategy where we set these big goals and then try to organize people around meeting those goals, and the governor uses the bully pulpit, uses the money he has, and frankly we feel quite lucky, well, not just lucky, but we feel fortunate that we have Race to the Top money to apply to some of that reform agenda. STEM is one of the items that was woven throughout that, and there is money for new technology for schools in that. There's half of our money, of our Race to the Top money, goes directly to the participating school districts, and a lot of that, the biggest portion of that money goes to technology. So we recognize that there needs to be an upgrade, but we're using the tools that we have at the state level to really raise the level of discussion and, frankly, implementation around STEM.
Congressman, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I think look at what some other states are doing. Not that Colorado necessarily gets 100% right, but we have a very robust, what we call a dual enrollment program.
Mm-hmm.
It's something I think we want to encourage at the federal level. Many of our high schoolers are taking college courses. Because the funding stream for K-12 is more robust than the higher education funding stream, we're actually, and I would encourage other states to look at creative ways the kids can technically remain part of K-12, and 19 and 20-year-olds and effectively have the K-12 serve as the financing mechanism for them taking 3-4 college courses. We're graduating many kids with associate's degrees from high school, typically around age 19. So that's something that it's strictly at the state level, but whatever we can do to encourage at the federal level, I think would be great.
And that's particularly good for students who think that they're not going to be successful at post-secondary. It gives them an opportunity to try that early.
For first-generation college goers, it's critical because, I mean, there's just no family legacy of having succeeded at college. To have succeeded at a college-level course at a university by the time they graduate high school, even if it's short of an associate's degree, just breaks through that psychological barrier. Yes, there's still an economic barrier, and we need to deal with that, but they're just as important, if not more, as the economic barrier is the psychological barrier.
So on the technology in schools, one thing it's worth noting, we've addressed most of the infrastructure challenge, getting computers in the classroom, getting broadband. The next challenge is the human layer, getting teachers more comfortable and getting the applications developed and built that students can use. And so that's the challenge that we're now focused on. It's critical. It's not going to happen right away. You're right to be impatient about it. We all should be impatient. Jim Shelton's job at the Department of Education is to be impatient on this very issue. So thanks for raising it.
I'll just add one quick vignette, which is one of the projects that we funded recently is something called Fold It. Has anyone heard of Fold It? Protein chemistry. So everything's called protein folding. There are millions of kids that are using this as a video game. They're solving protein folding problems. And it's really amazing. I really urge you to look at it, if nothing else, just as an example of how this might be changing. FOLDIT.
Also, if you want to learn more about that or these college programs or other STEM, there's a report we did in October that goes through all of that. It's called Refueling STEM Education. It actually talks about
But does it talk, oh, great.
It talks about actually Howard Hughes Medical Institute doing first-year research programs for undergrads and how critical that is. That's
Early career stuff, yeah.
early career stuff, very critical. Yes, sir.
Joshua Mia with the Global Innovation Forum. I have a question for Mr. Bolgiano, sort of a somewhat technical question. I'll keep it short. I'm fascinated by your suggestion that the next 20 years is going to be bio and statistics. And most of my friends who are focusing in that area, in math, let's say, there's so many different types of math you can study, but you mentioned statistics. And I'm curious of whether you could say how you would sort of prioritize where colleges would target sort of entrepreneurial ventures to students studying in math. Like most of my friends who are studying in math in graduate school, for example, don't see how entrepreneurship is attached to it. So what types of, is stats sort of what you would suggest that people should be looking into? I mean, because this is fascinating that you said this.
Well, first of all, there's a lot of people that are talking about analysis just because we've never seen this volume of data before. Even in social sciences, in biosciences. So we've never had so much data come in such a short amount of time, and the ability to look for patterns, look for solutions, look for answers, look for discoveries is based on some really high-level pure math. And so I would say a very emphatic yes. Statistics is going to be a big part. If you Google, you'll see all sorts of quotes in the last 6 months from Tim O'Reilly to elected officials to whatever that say statistics is going to be really the next tech, and it really has a lot to do with, we have this mountain of data. You can query Facebook or Twitter just like it was a database. We've always had our databases in separate servers. We're going to be able to search data like we search full text documents on the web right now. I don't think very few people realize what a huge change is about to happen because of this big data phenomenon. So yes, statistics.
Okay, thanks. Yes, sir.
My name is George Willenmeyer, GTW Associates. It's an international standards and trade policy consultancy. Congratulations to ITIF for organizing this wonderful event. I really appreciate that. When I go home, I'll use a search tool to look at the innovation strategy for the term standards. That's my business. Anish described essentially a standard solution when he was talking about the ability to transfer confidential data from one point to the other. Mark described him coming from a standards-based organization. Jared, certainly his companies were based on standards activities. What role do you see any sort of a national policy with respect to the government's participation in standard setting in the innovation policy? And I'd just like to hear from any of you that have a point of view.
Let me start with a couple points. And for those who don't know George's work, it really is first rate. He's got a website which is one of the critical sites in the field. We are having a national conversation on this topic, that is we in the standards community. There's an RFI, I believe the responses just come in. We're almost at 100 on this topic of what's the right role the government should have in standards. In their document itself, you'll notice a few areas this comes up. Health IT, if Anish were here to talk about it, he would emphasize it. The type of innovation Anish talked about is dependent on health IT standards leadership. The government has been helping to use that power of convening. That safe, secure email he mentioned was one episode in that. Smart grid is an area we spend a little time talking about in this report. That's an area where NIST has played a very constructive role leading standards development. In the wireless innovation effort and the wireless innovation and infrastructure initiative that Anish talked about, there's a key role for NIST and standards development, particularly around public safety communications. And finally, I would just mention educational technology is another one where, again, getting certain standards can enable markets to work more effectively. That's a theme that's in this document as well. So, George, there's a lot in there. There's a broader conversation about what's the whole toolkit look like, but a lot of the specific areas that I've just touched on are noted in the report.
Yeah, I would love some thoughtful work around what criteria we would use about when the federal government should and shouldn't be involved with standards. I mean, for all the examples where we talked about where we should, there's also examples where we shouldn't, and I think rightfully so. We didn't get involved with, whether it's Blu-ray and HDTV or the famous beta versus VHS. No role for government standards. As I was listening to my friends up here, but I was also looking at this proposal for a national standard on high-speed rail at the same time. So I don't know whether that's needed or not. I don't have the technical expertise, but this is a proposal that somebody had given me that we're looking through. But if there are some criteria that we can use as kind of a rubric for looking at when we should and shouldn't look at standards, that would be very helpful.
And how we should and shouldn't. This is the conversation that I mentioned. This request for information is out there for. It really is important. So I agree.
Great. Yes, ma'am.
Good morning. My name is Julia Klein. I'm an entrepreneur from the Philadelphia area. I employ a couple hundred people in the very glamorous world of building supplies. I'm also on the board of a billion-dollar regional health system. And it strikes me that in my world, we use IT to innovate. We use IT to operate. We buy a lot of IT, but we don't do IT. So I'd like your comments on where you see innovation and innovation policy happening in areas where IT is a backbone, but not the reason for being. Places where it's very unsexy or invisible, but necessary.
So first, how did you hear about this event, by the way?
Because I'm just kind of in the innovation world.
Well, that's awesome. So I think one thing that's...
So our reach is global.
I am really impressed.
At least as far as Philadelphia.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I think she's Joe's friend. That must be here.
So let me answer first, because Jared's answer will be better than mine, and so I can at least set the bar low. So the innovation should be throughout all segments of the economy. This is an important point. One reason IT is such a critical platform is that it can catalyze productivity throughout all segments of the economy. In your area, buildings and building supplies, one thing to think about is, a supply chain, how that works. So Walmart most famously has used IT to have huge efficiencies in their operations. In buildings and how buildings operate, building efficiency is a great area of opportunity in the energy space. In other spaces, being more efficient is important too. And IT is a great enabling infrastructure. And with wireless connectivity, would be RFID or sensors, we're going to have more and more opportunities to be efficient in how we do every part of our economy. And so those who are innovative will look at whatever segment they're in and will ask the question, how is IT creating better efficiency opportunities than existed before? And where we're focused most is on some of these national priorities: education, healthcare, energy, but the opportunities are going to be throughout the economy. Jared's actually done that in some sectors, so he can talk from personal experience.
Yeah, I mean, so, and I wish I had greater wisdom about how to apply it, but what we basically did in Flowers, Pro Flowers, is applied an IT solution to the flower industry and built a, $300 million company based on that. We basically disintermediated the supply chain. What was important to the consumers was not what we were doing, which happened to be allowing them to buy directly from the grower as opposed to going through wholesalers and retailers and basically using the internet and dynamically generated shipping labels and so forth to do that, the solution that we came up with. What was important is that they were getting better flowers at a better price. So it should happen in areas where there's an active market dynamic. Now, you have areas where there is not what I would call an active market dynamic, for instance, healthcare, where you have large providers, large networks, you don't have the same kind of price competition, you don't have the same incentive. So I guess the question before us really is how to either centrally direct or create market mechanisms that allow for the same type of IT-based efficiency enhancements in areas that are traditionally less influenced by markets, like public education and healthcare. I don't have a silver bullet, but that's the challenge.
Well, one thing I would add, we did an event a couple of years ago with a gentleman who wrote a University of Chicago book called Broken Buildings, Busted Budgets, and I'm blanking on his name now, but it was really an excellent book.
It started with a B, I think.
Pardon? That was Ben Bernanke, I think that was. And it was all about how the construction industry really wasn't using innovation and technology. But anyway, one of the points that came up on that is the government is the largest buyer of construction services in the world. And I know, Phil, you have procurement in there, and you also are thinking strategically about how government procurement can drive innovation. And so that's another avenue by which you can implement, obviously, your strategy. So we have time for just one quick question. Yes, sir.
Hi, Daniel Goldfarb from Americans for Energy Leadership. We're a innovation and competitiveness policy advocacy group here in DC that are trying to build a national constituency. Congressman Paulus, you mentioned that the Republican continuing resolution, and you didn't mention this, but that potentially the Senate Dems continuing resolution proposal both have parts of them that could seriously limit our innovation capacity 5, 10, and 15 years out. I was interested from you and from the panel at large, what specifically are the most important things in there that we should be, making some noise about? And also for the 2012 budget debate, what really are the key components there in your mind that we should be fighting over?
So in terms of political fights, certainly there is a particular effort to have it out for renewable energy research in many areas, preventing federal projects from moving forward to effectively far below the kind of pro rata cuts that are affecting other areas to destroy investment in these kinds of areas. The second is, if you will, the pro rata cuts. And again, we're arguing that you don't want to cut your seed corn in this case, and that these are areas where, in fact, additional investment is merited in terms of the medium and long-term interests of the economy. As a total percentage of federal expenditures, research expenditures are not large. There is a way, and the president, I think, sets the parameters in his budget document, where we can be fiscally responsible at the same time as increase investment in some of these areas that we've identified, namely education and research. So rather than cut them along with everything else, well, first of all, let me just do the 20,000-foot level. What the Republicans are trying to do is actually impossible. They're saying balance the budget, but they're saying defense and revenues are off the table. We're only looking at domestic discretionary spending, which is a very small pot of total expenditures. They're saying we're not talking about entitlements. Maybe theoretically we want to. We're certainly not talking about revenue. God forbid, no taxes, and defense is off the table. So somehow we're going to look at this one little pot of domestic discretionary money. I think it's on the order of 12% of the budget, and we're going to try to balance on the back, which means A, extremely severe cuts in that area, which is everything we're talking about here, and B, you're still not going to balance the budget. You just can't, based on that thing. So that's a 20,000-foot level of kind of what we're up against. So the response, again, is, yes, fiscal responsibility. In fact, guess what? More fiscal responsibility than what you're offering, because we are including a discussion about defense, and we are including a difficult discussion about revenues. We want to do, we want to make sure we're not doing anything, presumptuous there, but there needs to be on the table. And yes, the president has put entitlements on the table with his commission that he looked at there too. So we need to look at everything. And then B, within this pot of domestic discretionary, there's some expenditures and some waste that we can absolutely take on. But we want to separate out what is fundamentally investment in our future, what is accretive to taxpayers in a reasonable period of time, and say these are areas that we are singling out, not only for cuts, but we actually need renewed investment. Because if we look at their impact not only on our economy, but on our federal budget deficit in the 5-year time frame, the 10-year time frame, these are actually accretive to taxpayers.
Great. On that point, I think we need to close. Let me just say a couple of quick points. One, again, a reminder for tomorrow's event with Qualcomm CEO Paul Jacobs and Senator Amy Klobuchar. If you bring your ITIF frequent attendee card, you'll get extra points for tomorrow's event, which you can redeem for an iPad later on. So I want to, first of all, I want to thank Phil and his team and Ben Jones there and others. Really, a great effort. I know, speaking for ITIF, I think everybody in the room, we want to help you make this plan a success, because this is about the United States being a success and everybody in the United States being a success. So thank you, Phil. And also thank you for a great panel here for everybody.